Second question to Mr. Manano. Yeah, when will the Filipino government honor its promise made in 1999 to tow away the rusted ship in the second Thomas Shoal to make sure that we would no longer have such a dispute in the South China Sea? Thank you.
And do we have time for Dr. Wu Shiqun?
Simple question to Secretary Manaro. Don't leave away, okay? Just last year, the Philippines issued two important laws with regard to such a sea issue. One of these is Maritime Zone Act, in which the Philippines claims Sculptor Shore, Huangyandao, both, and Ren'ai, the second Thomas Shore, as Philippines territories. If we look at the treaty in 1898 between United States and Spain, we called it the Paris Treaty. The Philippines, the West Philippine maritime boundary is situated at east longitude 118 degrees. So how it comes? The territory, the Huangyandao and Ren'ai were sitting in the Philippines territory. If it is the case, the Ren'ai is Philippine territory, why the Philippines, by grounding the military vessels on the second Thomas Shore rather than publicly, directly occupied by troops? Thank you.
Finally, last but not least, Minister Manalo, could you address the question raised by Senior Colonel Zhou Bo about whether or not the Philippines, whether there was a promise regarding the removal of the Sierra Madre that the Philippines grounded against Second Thomas Shoal in 1999, and the response to Dr. Wu Shiqun about the recent maritime legislation passed by the Philippines. I believe it was in September 2024.
Yeah, thank you. Before I do that, could I just also have a couple of additional points? First, of the arbitral award. It's clear that the arbitral award of 2016 is legally binding. It's part of international law, and our only hope is that one day China can abide by the arbitral ruling. It would certainly ease tensions. On the issue of the Ayungin, we call it Ayungin Shoal in the Philippines. It's Second Thomas Shoal. There was never any promise to take out the ship. But what we should really take account of is, why is there such a huge presence of Chinese Coast Guard vessels around Ayungin Shoal? I mean, that's the question. That was the reference I made earlier. That shoal is only 70 nautical miles from Philippine territory, yet it's hundreds of miles away from Hainan Island. Why are there so many Chinese Coast Guard ships there? Is it their territory? Anyway, if we follow the UNCLOS or the arbitral award, we are clearly within our rights to patrol that area. But we don't pose any threat. We're merely in that area exercising our rights. Then on the Maritime Zones Bill, that is a sovereign act of the Philippines. It's merely aimed to clarify what is in our maritime zone, because without that clarity, if we ever undertake negotiations, for example, to settle any disputes or claims, you need to have that certainty of what we're talking about. And in fact, in many ways, the definition of our maritime zones will add to peace and stability in the region, rather than leave it uncertain. Without the presence of a maritime zone. And just one other point, if I may, on the issue of the behavior or professional behavior, because as we all know, certainly our services are very professional. But unfortunately, last year in 2023 and 24, the Philippine Coast Guard vessels experienced a number of incidents of ramming, water cannoning, even the use of a laser. Our desire was that perhaps we could behave professionally. If there are any differences, we could use the standard ways of informing other vessels, perhaps if we feel they're not in the right place here or there. We use the mechanisms provided for by the IMO and not resort to water cannoning or ramming. And I think it's very important that by using these kind of tactics, we only raise tensions. There are other ways that we can reduce tensions, but these are not the way to do it. Thank you.
First, you mentioned that South China Sea has been a constant flashpoint. I remember when I was at the Asian Department attending the ASEAN meetings, the journalists from Europe, from the world, all asked about tension. Nobody was interested in what we were discussing, the cooperation, the partnership. Over the past years, since the end of the Cold War, there has been dozens of wars in the world. Now we have currently 2 hot wars going on. But in spite of the flashpoints as you mentioned for the years, we have not had a war in Asia. Can people reflect why? Why we have managed to have negotiate, to talk, to find a solution, or at least to prevent the conflict growing to a serious war? It's precisely because after the end of the Cold War, the whole region has a very strong consensus that our objective is to develop economy, is to maintain peace and stability. And this, if you go to the countries in Asia, you'll see the robust economy. Everybody's interested in driving forward. So that's the main trend in the region. And the South China Sea dispute is nothing new. It's not now. When U.S. is paying attention, now that you see the Chinese behavior, you feel concerned. It's the South China Sea. China's ownership goes long in the history, but it's also a very important part of the post-Second World War arrangement. In Cairo Declaration, in Boston Proclamation, it was clearly written that the islands and shores, all the territories occupied Japan, is returned to China. So 1947, Chinese technicians boarded on an American-chartered boat, a vessel, went to check the territories and water and draw the 7 dotted line to indicate that these territories have returned to China. But the dispute started 70s, 90s, it went more and more serious. But U.S., well, in the dispute, U.S. has always maintained a neutral position. They don't want to take sides. What concerns China now is the shadow of U.S. behind the claimants. That alerts the Chinese side. There's a great concern about losing these territories. We cannot lose them. We have very strong position on ownership, but we, as one of the major countries in the region, we have to take responsibility about the regional stability. So we have to constrain ourselves. On one hand, we cannot renounce our sovereignty. On the other hand, we have to take responsibility for the peace and stability. That balance is not easy to strike, but China has done quite well, and that's the important background for the Asian miracle.
Thank you for that. I found what you said very interesting about the map and the dotted line about it being China's claims to territories. That's the first time I've actually heard that, because China has, in its various Ministry of Foreign Affairs statements, actually talked about the historic rights or the historic claims over the waters of the South China Sea. What you're saying appears to be, in a sense, a little bit more consistent with international law insofar as China is only claiming the territories within the dash line as opposed to the entirety of the waters within the dash line. But let me turn now to you, Minister Manalo. Do you feel, from the Philippines' perspective, that is actually quite peaceful, as Madam Fu Ying suggests, it's quite peaceful in the South China Sea, or do you feel it's more a situation of the strong doing what they can and the weak suffering what they must?
Well, there's not a conflict, but there's certainly high tensions and the potential for the tensions to even rise further. Unfortunately, the latter point that you made, I think the basic issue here is that we are following international law. Whenever the Philippines undertakes any kind of activity within our exclusive economic zone, as defined by UNCLOS, we feel we are within our rights. But when another country, let's say, applies its own domestic laws to certain areas within our EEZ, then it really does create the kind of tension that we have been experiencing, especially over the last 2 years. And our basic point is we have to follow international law as agreed, and in this case, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And countries which are exercising their rights in accordance with that law should have the right to exercise that law. And countries, I think, who reinterpret that law or apply their own domestic laws to certain areas and try to enforce them, then I think we're in a situation which leads to further tensions. And I think the only way forward is for countries who have signed on, for example, to agreements such as UNCLOS, to abide by what these agreements call for. And I think that would be the best way to reduce tensions. But if this is not the case, then the rich, the powerful, who will actually be in a position to assert their own laws against the weaker countries, I believe then we're in for a period of even greater tension. Nevertheless, we're always open to talks and discussions to try and resolve whatever differences we have in accordance with international law.
Thank you. So I was in Beijing last month for several meetings as well as the US-China dialogue, Track 2 dialogue. I think the sense that it was the Philippines that was being very provocative in the South China Sea was quite palpable to me. It was consistent across many conversations that I had. From what I hear from you, the Philippines is merely defending its sovereign rights and jurisdiction within its exclusive economic zone. Is that correct?
Precisely. For example, in one area, the Ayungin Shoal is only 70 nautical miles from Philippine territory. Yet we had experienced many incidents preventing our ability to resupply our ship on the shoal by China, for example. And the shoal lies hundreds of miles from the territory of China. So what I'm simply saying is we're merely exercising our rights within our own exclusive economic zone. I don't see how that can be provocative. In fact, it's an assertion of rights as provided by law.
And I suppose in some sense, it's not just China that's concerned about what the Philippines is doing, but there is some worry within ASEAN countries as well about whether the Philippines has been too forward-leaning, despite its rights, right? Has been too forward-leaning in terms of pushing back against China. Would you agree with that assessment?
No, I don't think I could agree with that. Of course, the ASEAN countries have nuanced positions on certain issues, but I've never heard that discussed. That's something that's being, I think, floated around. But I don't understand why countries would consider our actions provocative. Many countries in the region have come out in support of the incidents which happened involving the Philippines. We have Japan, Australia, Republic of Korea, Canada, many EU countries, New Zealand, Republic of Korea. I think these are countries who feel that what we have been doing is in accordance with international law. And I haven't heard any country really come out against what we've been doing except for one.
I won't ask you who. You mentioned Japan, Australia, the ROK, and New Zealand coming out in support of what the Philippines is doing. Would you like to see, I didn't hear any mention of Southeast Asian countries. Would you like to see Southeast Asia or ASEAN do more? Or at least say more?
Well, you know, we have in the past couple of years also had concluded bilateral MOUs with, for example, Vietnam, and we've agreed in those MOUs to settle whatever differences we might have through peaceful means and through dialogue, which is what we want to do. And in fact, with Vietnam, we are now strategic partners. We've also undertaken similar consultations with other countries in the region, including the claimant states. And in that sense, we're seeing how we can cooperate together, especially in the context of the ongoing negotiations on the Code of Conduct for the South China Sea. So I think We are trying to steadily create a better understanding of the situation among claimant states in ASEAN, as well as our regional neighbors. And I think we have been, so far, getting fairly positive results on the diplomatic track. Thank you.
Thank you. Odd that given that China's main concerns are about the United States, why China would not seek, given that priority, to make nice with its neighbors, perhaps not in relation to the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, which are very intractable, it's hard to resolve, but why would China not actually make nice with its neighbors over the maritime resource claims? China's influence in Southeast Asia is good and improving, and it strikes me that the main thorn in the side of its relations with its neighbors has been the South China Sea dispute. So if it were worried about the United States and US influence in Asia, the US is already gaining ground with, say, countries like Japan, South Korea, etc., why would China not make nice with its Southeast Asian neighbors in the South China Sea?
You talk like China is making a game with the United States, trying to either pull this neighbor close or kick that neighbor away. That's not the Chinese way of thinking. U.S. has launched this strategic competition with China, but you don't hear China talking about accepting, defining our relationship with U.S. as competition. We have used the term describing relationship since Trump's first term. That is a peaceful coexistence, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation. Coming back to your concerns, the senator said about freedom of navigation, and Minister Ong mentioned the presence of military ships in South China Sea. At this moment, they operate quite professionally. China comes out, and only when it comes too close to China. In the meantime, South China Sea is one of the busiest sea lane. About 500,000 trade ships pass through, and 40% of the global trade goes through South China Sea. When I was ambassador in London, I often check with the London market. The premium on shipping in South China Sea was never raised because of tension in the South China Sea. So these are local managed issues. But for the Philippines, China cannot agree for Philippines to occupy Second Thomas, Renaijiao, and Sabina, which is the Xianbinjiao, because that is a violation of the DOC. Everybody signed to. I remember that language, not to make more moves. That language was watered down with the Filipino request in order for Philippines to also sign up. So we all agreed. If the Philippines can take new rocks, how can you stop others? How can you stop China from taking more? We are capable. There's no problem. But we are exercising constraints because we are committed to this DOC. So that's a red line. No one should be allowed to cross. And the Second Thomas occurred in 1999. I was ambassador in the Philippines. It was May. The Philippine Navy rocked a ship to Second Thomas, calling us that they needed spare parts to repair. We believed them. That was in May. In November, I was already in Manila. We got another call. Another rock landed on Scarborough. And we thought we didn't believe it anymore. You can't keep on rocking on the shores. So with diplomatic presentations, we finally agreed, and the Philippines pulled that one back. Otherwise, we'll have more 20 years old ship staying there, pretending still repairing with the purpose of occupation. That kind of naughtiness shouldn't be encouraged, agreed. It has nothing to do with law. The law of the sea is about the water. That is not going to be determined and negotiated before the territories are decided. Although almost every country has expressed claims, but doesn't work because the territory dispute is not resolved yet. So when we say the Asian things to be dealt by the Asians, we mean these things we can, if it's a neighbor, as the Secretary said, weaker country, okay, we have that on our mind. We try to solve it peacefully. You've stayed 24 years, 25 years, you stay on. But you should not formally occupy it. The vicinity of a territory with the mainland is not the reason to claim the territory. That's the part of the reason of the international law. I think.
Sorry, thank you so much. I'm so glad you made the distinction between territories versus maritime rights, which is governed by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. I haven't read the Declaration on the Code of Conduct for the South China Sea for some time. It was concluded in 2002. But I cannot remember whether or not it was about non-occupation of land features as opposed to which are above water at high tide, or about occupation of low tide and submerged features within the exclusive economic zone of a coastal state and therefore within its sovereign rights and jurisdiction. So that's just one point that I'd like to place on the table for checking later on. But the other point you mentioned about China operating professionally in the South China Sea, I think even the United States has agreed that by and large China has conducted itself professionally in the South China Sea, but I think there are concerns nonetheless that occasionally, and we saw one in just the last couple of days, there are dangerous maneuvers at sea and in the air. And I think China recently protested an Australian aircraft, I believe, and it was a dangerous maneuver. I think that was widely reported. So I'd like to move on to the next topic, which is generally about reducing the risk of military escalation at sea and air. We talked about the COC, the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct deals with activities that claimant states can conduct on features in the South China Sea as well as maritime claims around those features. But here we're talking about perhaps a Code of Conduct for military or navies in the South China Sea as well as Coast Guard. What can be done, Senator Coons, to reduce the risk of escalation in the South China Sea in respect of military to military or navy to navy or Coast Guard to Coast Guard encounters?
Well, look, some of the challenges we're talking about are global. We are focusing specifically on the South China Sea, but freedom of navigation operations and working in partnership to combat aggressive actions in other parts of the world is something we've participated in for decades. Right now, in the Red Sea, the United States and a number of other navies have been acting to prevent the Houthis from attacking commercial shipping. That is a very different level of tension and conflict. In the South China Sea, making sure that professional conduct is not the majority, but is uniformly what is observed, and avoiding unintended collisions, accidents, and then escalation is a key responsibility of major powers and of partners in the region. The incident you referenced with the Australian aircraft is just one of many in the air and on the sea that have come close to causing serious incidents. The Biden administration in the United States worked very hard to open lines of communication between the United States and the PRC, between our Navy and Air Force, and making sure that we have the ability to communicate quickly so that there isn't a misunderstanding. I think this is something that needs to be sustained and advanced. And I think clarity about our goals and expectations are important. The Code of Conduct and an underlying respect for international law and for the rights and interests of parties in the region should be the basis for our conducting ourselves in a way that ensures the sort of sustained economic development that Madam Fu Ying spoke about in her opening remarks, something that is the goal of all of us, sustained economic progress, but respect for each other's interests, territories, and conduct is also critical for avoiding unintentional conflict.
Thank you. What really stayed with me from a conversation that I had in Beijing was that in this speaker's view, there were plenty of there were possible lines of communication as well as plenty of mechanisms to reduce the risk of escalation at sea or in the air, but that China did not see why, in the event of a political disagreement, say for instance the visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, did not see why they should have to have recourse to those lines of communication or mechanisms. In your view, Madam Fu Ying, is the onus on China to have recourse to these mechanisms for de-escalating tensions, regardless of the circumstances surrounding that particular escalation? Or should the onus be on the United States and other naval powers to avoid actions that China considers provocative?
First, about the freedom of navigation, in bracket by the U.S. side, is not in its literal sense of freedom of navigation. It's not about commercial navigation. It's U.S. Navy's a way of testing the constraints by the countries of the freedom of navigation of U.S. military vehicles. I think U.S. has been operating it for a long time. But even with this U.S. military voyage in the South China Sea, there's no specific restrictions, even according to the law of the sea, according to the international law. There is a freedom of navigation. The problem comes only when it comes too close. And you know how many military exercises are held in the South China Sea? More than the commercial activities. But that has to be really, that there has to be better sense of avoiding danger, avoiding conflict. I agree with the senator that in the later months of Biden administration, the two sides has started fairly stable and constant dialogue in all fields, including in the military dialogues. And it is hoped that this administration is also sending signals of having contact and dialogues, and there's a clear message of avoiding conflict, avoiding war. But what impressed me, I wonder if Senator can explain to us, those of us from Asia who have been listening to what's going on in Munich. Actually, we are really the quiet corner compared with the other discussions. Your Defense Minister Hexes said on the 12th in Brussels that the U.S. has to pull back to prevent a war in the Pacific. I think the original is to deter a war with China in the Pacific, and because of the scarcity of the resources, so they have to pull their effort out back from NATO to Asia Pacific, so they don't lose the deterrence. What does he exactly mean? The Asians were asking each other. We want to know what kind of war does he mean.
Perhaps.
Sorry, I don't have the. I know it's your right to ask question. This is a comment.
Perhaps an.
My name is Anshali Ruland. I work for a legislator.
Could you please use the mic? It's to your left. Thank you.
Thank you. Anshali Ruland. I work for a legislator in German Parliament. Madam, I had the chance to listen to your Foreign Minister's speech yesterday. He spoke up in favor of the rules-based order and in favor of abiding to the rules. At the same time, China does not accept the 2016 international ruling of a court that spoke out in favor of Philippine claims and rejected Chinese claims.
You mean arbitration?
Yeah, the 2016 ruling. And so my question to you is, how do these two elements go together? On the one hand, supporting the international order, but when these rules clash with Chinese interests, they're not always supported. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Perhaps we can have the panel respond. I think there was a question for everyone, so.
First, about the arbitration. I don't know how much you know the law of the sea. According to the law of the sea, one can go to arbitration on conditions. First, you should have exhausted the negotiations, and that it should be balanced. And the Philippines didn't even tell us they went to arbitration. And the result is very one-sided. And according to the conventional law, arbitration is not final. It can be challenged. And the first country which challenged the arbitration is United States about the Nicaragua Bay. And currently, EU still has a case. I think it's Serbia or something, and being challenged. So challenging arbitration is very normal.
Okay, my first question goes to Senator. You are right in saying that the United States has been conducting freedom of navigation for decades, right? My question for you is very simple. The United States is not a country that has ratified UN Convention Law of the Sea, although you have signed it, right? So the question is, if the UN security, if UNCLOS is so good, why don't you ratify it? If it is not good, why would you challenge others in the name of it?
Senator Coons.
I think the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is an excellent convention, one whose ratification I've supported, as have many senators. But the larger point is that the tradition globally and for decades of making sure that the seas are open for commerce has been a foundation of our role globally and many of our partners and allies in making sure that territorial claims and disputes between other nations doesn't interfere with free commerce globally. As a maritime power, as a Pacific power, as a country that has been engaged throughout the arc of its national history in trying to keep the seas free and open, this is an obligation that we take on freely and that I believe contributes to stability and security.
Thank you. I hope that under this administration, you might, maybe you and other senators might be able to convince this administration that it is to put U.S. interests first to actually accede to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
As a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I have worked diligently over a number of Congresses because I think it strengthens the clarity of our purpose. And I wasn't present for Secretary Hegseth's comments, so I can't speak to them directly, but I do think it was principally, it's been mischaracterized, I think. It was principally focused on encouraging European partners to share some of the operational and military burden of supporting and supplying Ukraine. And the emphasis, at least as I heard it, was on avoiding conflict with China, not seeking conflict with China.